Imagine waking up one day and realizing that nothing is actually wrong with your life. Yet something inside you feels constantly dissatisfied. You are not starving. You are not in danger. You are not lacking entertainment. And yet, you feel restless, unfulfilled, and strangely tired of everything. This quiet dissatisfaction is not accidental. Philosophers like Schopenhauer believed that modern humans suffer not because life is too hard, but because pleasure has become too easy. Not meaningful pleasure, not earned satisfaction, but cheap pleasure, the kind that costs nothing to access and everything to maintain. Cheap pleasure is dangerous because it doesn't arrive as pain. It arrives as comfort. It arrives disguised as relief, as a reward, as something harmless, a scroll before sleep, a video to escape boredom, a taste to fill emotional emptiness, a moment of stimulation to avoid silence. Each act feels small, almost invisible. But Schopenhauer understood something unsettling. The human mind does not forget. It adapts, and what it adapts to becomes its new baseline. Cheap pleasure resets your baseline downward. What once excited you now barely moves you. What once satisfied you now feels dull. And so you consume more, not because you want more, but because you need more, just to feel normal. This is how dependence begins. Not dramatic, not obvious, but quiet. Schopenhauer believed that desire itself is suffering. Because the moment desire is satisfied, it disappears and leaves behind emptiness. Cheap pleasure accelerates this cycle. You desire, you consume, you feel a brief release. Then the emptiness returns, stronger than before. So you repeat, not because it fulfills you, but because it temporarily silences discomfort. And over time, you begin to fear discomfort itself. You avoid boredom. You avoid stillness. You avoid silence, because silence reminds you of everything you've been avoiding. This is why cheap pleasure is never free. It demands payment, not immediately, but gradually, charges you with reduced attention, reduced patience, reduced self-respect. You begin to struggle with effort. Work feels heavier. Focus feels unnatural. Discipline feels cruel. Not because the tasks are harder, but because your nervous system has been trained for constant stimulation. Schopenhauer warned that the greatest tragedy is not suffering, but becoming incapable of meaning. Cheap pleasure numbs meaning. It turns life into a series of distractions, instead of a journey of purpose. You are busy, but not fulfilled, occupied, but not advancing, entertained, but not satisfied, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to feel disappointed in yourself. Not loudly, not consciously, but in the quiet moments, when stimulation fades, that moment when the screen turns off, and there is nothing left to consume. That moment reveals the cost. You realize you traded depth for ease, growth for comfort, strength for relief, and the worst part is that no one forced you. You chose it, again and again. Schopenhauer believed that real pleasure is rare because it requires effort. It requires restraint, patience, endurance, the pleasure of progress, the pleasure of mastery, the pleasure of becoming something better than yesterday. These pleasures do not shout. They do not seduce. They whisper. And because they whisper, they are easily ignored. Cheap pleasure screams. It demands attention, promises escape. It offers comfort now, in exchange for strength later. This is the trade most people make. Without realizing it, they trade long-term satisfaction for short-term relief, and they wonder why life feels empty. The emptiness is not a mystery. It is the residue of unearned pleasure. Schopenhauer argued that happiness is not found in constant pleasure, but in the reduction of unnecessary desire. The less you crave stimulation, the more peace you experience. The more you resist cheap pleasure, the more control you regain. because control is the foundation of freedom. Without control over your impulses, you are not free. You are managed by urges, by habits, by reflexes. Cheap pleasure creates a soft prison. Prison with no bars. No guards. No obvious suffering. Just comfort and repetition. Days blur together. Weeks disappear. Years pass. And suddenly, you realize you've been busy without building anything. This realization is painful, but it is also powerful, because awareness is the beginning of escape. The moment you see cheap pleasure for what it truly is, it loses its illusion. You begin to ask different questions. Not, does this feel good? But, does this make me stronger? Not, will this help me relax? But, what will this cost me tomorrow? These questions change everything. Schopenhauer believed that suffering cannot be eliminated, but it can be chosen wisely. There is suffering that weakens, and suffering that strengthens. Cheap pleasure avoids strengthening suffering, and multiplies weakening suffering. Discipline, effort, restraint feel uncomfortable now, but they create stability later. Cheap pleasure feels comfortable now, but creates instability later. Anxiety, restlessness, lack of direction. The price is delayed, but unavoidable. And the longer you delay paying attention, the higher the interest becomes. This is why people feel trapped. Even when their lives appear easy, they are overstimulated, underdeveloped, and internally exhausted, not because they lack pleasure, but because they lack meaning. Meaning cannot be consumed. It must be built. Schopenhauer believed that the highest form of satisfaction comes from self-mastery, from choosing restraint when indulgence is available, from choosing effort when ease is tempting, from choosing growth when comfort is convenient. These choices are quiet. They are rarely praised. They are often lonely, but they accumulate. Each act of restraint strengthens the mind. Each resisted impulse builds control. Each uncomfortable effort increases confidence. Slowly, almost unnoticed, life begins to feel fuller, not louder, not easier, but richer. Silence becomes tolerable. Boredom becomes productive. Stillness becomes peaceful. You stop needing constant stimulation, because your inner world has depth again. This is the opposite of cheap pleasure. This is earned satisfaction. And earned satisfaction never leaves you empty. It leaves you tired, but proud, calm, but alert, grounded, but motivated. Schopenhauer warned that most people will never experience this, not because it is impossible, but because cheap pleasure is everywhere. It is normalized, encouraged, marketed. Avoiding it feels strange, almost rebellious. But rebellion against cheap pleasure is rebellion for your own soul. It is choosing long-term dignity over short-term comfort. It is choosing to become someone you respect, and respect is the foundation of inner peace. Without self-respect, no amount of pleasure can satisfy you, because deep down, when you are betraying yourself, cheap pleasure is a betrayal that happens quietly, but discipline is loyalty to your future self. So when you feel the urge to escape discomfort, to numb boredom, to avoid effort, pause, not to shame yourself, but to observe. Ask yourself what this moment is costing you, because cheap pleasure always comes at a high price, and the payment is never made immediately. It is made later, in silence, when no one is watching. That is where the real battle is fought, and that is where real strength is built.